Nobody in Portland believed a man could vanish from the middle of 250,000 people and simply never be seen again. Not with the whole city watching the water that night, not with 100 cameras pointed at the fleet of ships gliding down the Willamette River. And yet that is precisely what happened to Ethan Holloway on the second night of June in the year 2000. And it would take 21 years, a length of time in which the very technology used to search for him would be invented and reinvented 3 times over, before anyone understood how he disappeared or why. If you are watching this from Portland tonight, or from anywhere else in the world where this story has found you, tell us in the comments where you are joining us from, because cases like this one deserve to be remembered by as many people as possible. And because somewhere out there, someone might still be holding a piece of this puzzle they do not even know they have. Portland, in the summer of 2000, was a city that still moved at the pace of its own rivers, slow and patient, unhurried by the devices that would come to define the decades ahead. The internet existed, but it lived in a back room, dialed up through a phone line that hummed and screeched before it connected. And most households in the Alberta Arts District, where Ethan Holloway had grown up and never really left, did not yet have it at all. Cellular telephones were carried by lawyers and real estate agents, and the occasional teenager whose parents wanted to keep tabs on them, bulky devices with retractable antennas that cost by the minute and dropped calls if you walked into the wrong stairwell. If you wanted to reach someone in Portland that summer, you called their house, and if they were not home, you left a message on a machine or you simply waited until you saw them again, because that was still how a great many things in America were done. It was into this slower, quieter version of the city that Ethan Holloway had built a small but devoted following as the Voice of KROP, a community radio station that broadcast out of a converted storefront near Northeast Alberta Street, playing local bands, running call-in shows about neighborhood politics, and covering every June the one event that brought the entire city down to the water at once, the Portland Rose Festival. Ethan was 27 years old that summer, a tall, narrow-shouldered man with a mess of sandy brown hair he never quite managed to tame, and a voice that radio listeners described, without any apparent irony, as sounding like a friend leaning against your porch rail on a warm evening. He had pale grey eyes, a faint scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident, and a habit of tapping 2 fingers against his thigh when he was thinking through a sentence before he said it on air, a nervous tic that long-time listeners had come to find endearing rather than distracting. He had been the station manager at KROP for just under 3 years, having taken the job over from an aging folk musician who wanted to retire to the coast. And in that time, Ethan had transformed a struggling, low-wattage operation into something the neighborhood genuinely depended on. A place where you could hear about a lost dog, a city council vote on zoning, or a garage band's first single all within the same half hour. He lived alone in a rented duplex 6 blocks from the station, drove a faded green Ford Ranger with a KROP bumper sticker peeling at one corner, and had, according to nearly everyone who knew him, no enemies to speak of, which was precisely what made what happened to him so difficult for the city to reconcile in the years that followed. He did have, however, a sister, and it was Claire Holloway who would spend the next 2 decades of her life refusing to let Portland forget her brother's name. Claire was 24 in the summer of 2000, 3 years younger than Ethan, working as a receptionist at a dental practice on Northeast Broadway while she finished night classes toward a teaching certificate. The 2 of them had lost their mother to cancer 4 years earlier, and their father had moved to Arizona not long after, remarried, and grown distant in the particular way that surviving parents sometimes do when grief reshapes a family into pieces that no longer fit together the way they once did. Claire and Ethan had filled that gap for each other. They had dinner together most Sundays at a diner on Fremont Street that Ethan liked because the waitress always refilled his coffee without being asked, and Claire had a standing arrangement to call the station every Friday afternoon during his show, just to hear his voice cut through the static and say her name on the air, a small ritual that made her laugh every single time, no matter how many times he did it. The Portland Rose Festival that year fell across the first week of June, and by the evening of the second, the city had reached its annual fever pitch. The Fleet Week ships, grey-hulled naval vessels open for public tours during the day, sat lit up and enormous against the darkening sky along the seawall, and the crowds that had gathered for the evening's fireworks display stretched for blocks in either direction along the waterfront park. KROP had, for the previous two festivals, run a modest live broadcast from a folding table near the river, Ethan narrating the scene for listeners who could not make it downtown themselves, describing the smell of kettle corn and diesel exhaust from the ships, the sound of a brass band somewhere behind the crowd, the particular quality of light that Portland got in early June when the rain finally let up and the whole city seemed to exhale at once. It had become one of the station's most beloved annual broadcasts, and that year Ethan had planned something slightly larger, a 2-hour special that would run from 7 in the evening until the fireworks concluded, with segments recorded throughout the day and woven together live. He left the station a little after 5 that afternoon, telling his engineer, a soft-spoken young man named Warren Pratt, who handled the technical side of KROP's broadcasts, that he was going to walk the festival grounds first to gather a few interviews before setting up the live table at 7. Warren would later tell investigators, and would go on telling anyone who asked for the next 21 years, that this was entirely ordinary behavior for Ethan, who liked to wander a crowd with his handheld recorder and a stack of blank cassette tapes, catching snippets of conversation and color that he would weave into the broadcast later. Warren stayed behind at the station to prepare the equipment for the live segment, expecting Ethan to return by 6:30 to help carry the folding table, the portable transmitter, and the milk crate of cassette tapes and cables down to the waterfront. Ethan never came back for the table. At 6:45, Warren called Ethan's apartment from the station phone and got no answer, which did not particularly alarm him, since Ethan did not carry a cellular telephone, and there was no way to reach him directly once he was out among the crowds downtown. Warren loaded the equipment into his own car, an aging Subaru wagon, and drove to the waterfront himself, assuming he would find Ethan already there, notebook in hand, ready to set up. He was not there. Warren waited at their usual spot near the seawall, close enough to the Fleet Week ships that the smell of the river and the diesel from the vessels mixed together in a way Ethan always said reminded him of childhood trips with their father, and he watched the crowd for the familiar shape of Ethan's green plaid shirt and sandy hair, and he did not see him. 7 o'clock came, and Warren went on the air alone, apologizing to listeners for a technical delay and promising Ethan would be joining shortly, and 8 o'clock came, and the fireworks began, and Ethan still had not appeared, and by the time the last shells burst over the river and the crowd began its slow dispersal into the summer night, Warren Pratt understood that something was deeply wrong, though it would be several more hours before anyone else in Portland understood it too. Claire Holloway had been listening to the broadcast from her apartment, curled on her couch with the volume turned up, the way she always did on festival nights, half expecting to hear her brother's voice cut in at any moment with some observation about the crowd or the ships, or the smell of the kettle corn. When Warren's voice kept apologizing for the delay, and then simply stopped mentioning Ethan at all, a small, cold thread of unease began to work its way through her chest, the kind of feeling she would later describe to investigators as something her body understood before her mind was willing to admit it. She called the station at 9, and Warren answered, and in the particular strained quality of his voice she heard everything she needed to know before he said a single word of explanation. She drove downtown herself that night, parking 3 blocks from the waterfront because the festival traffic had not yet cleared, and walked the length of the park in the last of the dispersing crowd, calling her brother's name into a darkness that swallowed it whole. She found nothing. No sign of him near the ships, no sign of him near the folding table Warren had abandoned near the seawall with the transmitter still dark, no sign of him among the vendors packing up their kettle corn machines and their strings of unsold festival lights. She called the Portland Police Bureau at 11 that night from a pay telephone near the waterfront, one of the last still standing on that block, and was told not unkindly but with the particular bureaucratic patience of the era that an adult male who had been missing for only a handful of hours on the single most crowded night of the city's calendar year did not yet meet the threshold for an active search, and that if he did not turn up by morning, she should come to the station in person to file a report. He did not turn up by morning. The investigation that opened the following day was conducted, as nearly all investigations in the year 2000 were conducted, without the tools that would later come to define police work.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
In America, there was no cellular phone to trace because Ethan did not own one. There was no email trail to comb through because Ethan barely used the station's single dial-up connection and had no personal account of his own. There was no network of security cameras blanketing downtown Portland the way there would be within another decade. Only a scattering of grainy black and white feeds from a handful of businesses along the waterfront, recorded onto videotape that had to be physically retrieved, physically reviewed on a monitor in the back of a squad room, frame by grainy frame, by detectives squinting at shapes that might or might not have been a tall man in a plaid shirt, somewhere at the edge of the frame. Detective Roy Sutton, a 19-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau, who had spent most of his career working burglaries before being rotated onto major crimes 2 years earlier, was assigned to lead the search, and he would later admit, in an interview conducted decades afterward, that the case had troubled him from the very first day, not because of any single piece of evidence, but because of the almost total absence of any evidence at all. A man does not simply dissolve out of a crowd of 200,000 people, Sutton would say, and yet that is what the evidence, or the lack of it, seemed to insist had happened. The search that followed in those first days was built entirely out of shoe leather and volunteer hours. Officers walked the length of the waterfront park with the tide charts in hand, checking the seawall and the shallows beneath the Hawthorne and Morrison bridges in case Ethan had fallen or been pushed into the river during the crush of the crowd, a possibility that haunted Claire for months, even after divers found nothing. Flyers went up within 48 hours, printed at a copy shop on Alberta Street, with a photograph Claire had chosen of Ethan laughing at their mother's old kitchen table. His grey eyes crinkled nearly shut, because it was the picture that looked most like him, most like the brother she wanted the city to search for. Volunteers from the neighbourhood, people who had grown up listening to KROP, or who simply wanted to help a family in crisis, canvassed the festival grounds and the surrounding blocks for a week, knocking on doors, asking vendors and food cart operators and ship crew members whether they remembered a tall young man with a cassette recorder asking questions about the festival that evening. A handful did remember him, or thought they did, placing him near the ships sometime before 6 in the evening, cheerfully asking a sailor about life aboard a naval vessel. But no one could place him after that hour, and the trail, such as it was, went cold at almost exactly the moment Warren Pratt had expected him back at the folding table. 2 names surfaced quickly in those first weeks, both drawn less from hard evidence than from the ordinary friction of small community life. The first was Owen Cross, who ran a hardware store 2 doors down from the KROP studio on Alberta Street, and who had, 3 weeks before the festival, engaged in a loud and public argument with Ethan on the sidewalk outside his shop after Ethan ran an on-air segment about a zoning dispute that Cross believed had painted him unfairly as an obstacle to a proposed bike lane the neighborhood association wanted installed in front of his store. Witnesses described the argument as heated, Cross red-faced and shouting that Ethan had no idea what he was talking about, Ethan calm but unyielding, refusing to run a correction because he stood by his reporting. It was the kind of dispute that would have been forgotten within a season under ordinary circumstances. 2 men who occupied adjoining storefronts snapping at each other over a matter of local politics. But once Ethan vanished, neighbors who had witnessed the argument brought it to Sutton's attention within days, and Cross found himself, for a period of some months, regarded with open suspicion by people he had known for years. The second name was Warren Pratt himself, a fact that would trouble Warren for the rest of his life in ways that Claire, decades later, would come to feel genuine sorrow over. Warren had been the last person, so far as anyone could determine, to speak with Ethan before he vanished, and he had been alone at the station for the better part of 2 hours during the window in which Ethan disappeared, with no one able to verify his whereabouts beyond his own account of preparing broadcast equipment. Detective Sutton questioned him 3 times over the course of that first month, and though nothing ever emerged to substantiate any suspicion, the mere fact of the questioning was enough to fracture something in the small community that had built up around the radio station. friends and volunteers unsure how to behave around a man who might, in the worst imaginings of a frightened neighborhood, have done something unspeakable to his own boss and friend. Neither lead produced anything of substance. Owen Cross's alibi, though imperfect by the standards of a later, more surveilled era, was corroborated by 2 customers who remembered him ringing up hardware purchases at his register throughout the early evening of June 2nd. Warren Pratt submitted to every question the police asked of him, volunteered his own account without hesitation, and in the absence of anything resembling physical evidence connecting him to Ethan's disappearance, the suspicion around him faded, though it never entirely disappeared. The way certain suspicions never quite disappear in a small enough community, resurfacing at odd moments for years afterward, in the sideways glances of people who should have known better. By the end of that first summer, the case had gone quiet, in the particular way that missing persons cases in the year 2000 tended to go quiet, not through any deliberate decision to stop looking, but through the slow attrition of resources and attention that happened when a case produced no new leads. Detective Sutton continued to work it alongside a growing caseload of newer, more urgent matters, checking in with Claire every few weeks at first, then every few months, the calls growing shorter and further apart, not out of indifference but out of the particular exhaustion that comes from having nothing new to say. The local newspaper ran a 6-month anniversary piece that October, a respectful but brief article buried on page 11 of the Metro section, and after that, coverage of Ethan Holloway's disappearance essentially ceased. The world, and Portland along with it, moved on, the way the world always insists on moving on, even when someone's sister refuses to. Claire Holloway did not move on, and the shape her refusal took over the following years became, in its own quiet way, a story worth telling on its own. She kept a version of the flyer taped inside her kitchen cabinet, the one with her brother laughing at their mother's table, and every June, on the anniversary of the festival, she printed a fresh batch and walked the waterfront park herself, taping them to lamp posts that the city would strip them from within days. A ritual she repeated so many years running that certain longtime festival vendors came to recognize her, to nod at her with a kind of gentle, sorrowful respect as she passed. She quit the dental practice within 2 years and finished her teaching certificate, taking a position at an elementary school in the same neighborhood where she and Ethan had grown up, partly, she would admit later, because she could not bring herself to leave the 6 blocks of Alberta Street that still held the last version of her brother the world had ever seen. She called the Portland Police Bureau's Missing Persons Unit on the 1st of every month for the first 5 years, then every 3 months for the 5 years after that, a diminishing but unbroken cadence of calls that detectives who rotated through the unit came to know her by name and by voice before they ever met her in person. The technology of the world around her changed with a speed that, in retrospect, felt almost cruel in what it might have offered her brother's case had it only arrived sooner. Cellular telephones went from luxury to necessity within the first half of that decade, and Claire often found herself wondering, in the quiet hours after her students had gone home, whether a phone in Ethan's pocket that night might have changed everything, might have let Warren reach him, might have pinged off some cellular tower and given detectives a location to search instead of a folding table gone cold. The internet matured from a dial-up curiosity into the connective tissue of ordinary life, and by the middle of the decade, Claire had built a modest website of her own, a single static page hosted through a service a computer-savvy cousin helped her set up, featuring the same photograph from the kitchen table, a timeline of what was known, and a tip-line email address that she checked every single night before bed for the better part of 15 years. Most nights finding nothing, some nights finding messages from strangers with theories that led nowhere, and twice, in all that time, finding messages that made her hands shake as she read them, though neither ultimately produced anything the police could use. Detective Roy Sutton retired from the Portland Police Bureau in 2009, 9 years after Ethan's disappearance, having never closed the case and having never quite stopped thinking about it either. In the years before his retirement, he had, at his own initiative, submitted what physical evidence existed in the file, principally a set of unidentified partial fingerprints lifted from Ethan's abandoned truck, which had been found parked near the KROP studio 3 days after the disappearance. its doors unlocked and a half-finished cup of coffee still sitting in the cup holder, gone cold and eventually mouldy before anyone thought to photograph it. There had been no cellular data to pull, no GPS trail, no digital footprint of any kind, beyond a handful of phone records from the station's landline, showing calls that matched Warren's own account of that evening. The fingerprints, run against the limited databases available at the time, matched no one on file. And without a modern, comprehensive DNA testing regime, that was where the physical evidence trail ended, a handful of ridges and whorls belonging to someone the system simply could not name. Warren Pratt kept the station running for another 11 years after Ethan's disappearance, eventually taking over as manager himself, a role he told friends he never felt he had earned, since it had only come to him because Ethan never returned to claim it. He grew visibly older, in a way that seemed accelerated by grief and by the low hum of suspicion that had never fully left him, thinning at the temples by his late 30s, developing the stooped posture of a man who spent too many hours hunched over broadcast equipment and too many years carrying a weight he had not been permitted to set down. He and Claire remained close throughout those years, bound together by the peculiar intimacy of two people who had loved the same missing man, meeting for coffee every few months to trade updates that increasingly amounted to nothing. To say Ethan's name aloud to someone who understood exactly what saying it cost. Owen Cross, the hardware store owner, sold his shop in 2006 and moved to Bend, on the other side of the Cascades, a relocation that some in the old neighborhood whispered about for a season before the whispers, too, faded into the general silence that had settled over the case. He would later tell a journalist, when the case was finally solved 2 decades on, that the suspicion he endured in those early years had cost him friendships and customers he never fully recovered, and that he understood, intellectually, why the community had looked at him the way it did, even as the unfairness of it never stopped stinging. The Portland Rose Festival continued every June without fail, the ships still arriving, the fireworks still bursting over the same stretch of river, and for Claire Holloway, the festival became something closer to a vigil than a celebration, a week she endured rather than enjoyed, walking the same stretch of waterfront every year, half expecting in some superstitious corner of her mind that she never fully admitted to anyone, that she might round a corner and simply find her brother there, cassette recorder in hand, asking a sailor about life aboard a ship, exactly as he had been the last time anyone saw him. By the time the case reached its 10th anniversary in 2010, it had acquired the particular status of a local legend, the kind of story long-time Portland residents told newcomers over drinks, a cautionary footnote about how a city could lose a person entirely, how a man beloved by an entire neighborhood could simply cease to exist in the middle of its biggest celebration and never be found. Claire gave an interview to a local news station on that anniversary, sitting in the same kitchen where the flyer still hung inside the cabinet door. Her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, saying that she had stopped waiting for answers and started simply insisting on them, a distinction she said made the difference between despair and persistence. The interview aired once, briefly renewed public interest for a week or two, generated a handful of new tip-line emails that led nowhere, and then, like everything else in the case's long history, faded. It was not until the final years of that decade, as the ordinary machinery of American criminal investigation transformed itself once again around a new technology, that the case began, almost imperceptibly at first, to stir back to life. Forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that combined traditional DNA analysis with the increasingly vast consumer genealogy databases that millions of ordinary Americans had voluntarily populated in pursuit of their own family histories, had by the mid-2010s begun cracking open cold cases across the country that had sat dormant for decades. Cases built on nothing more than an unidentified biological sample, and now the willingness of some distant cousin to spit into a tube and mail it to a laboratory in pursuit of their own ancestry. Portland's Cold Case Unit, formed in 2014 as a small dedicated team tasked with revisiting the department's oldest unsolved files, began, in the back half of that decade, working its way through a backlog of cases that included Ethan Holloway's, not because any dramatic new lead had emerged, but simply because his file had, at last, come up in the rotation. Detective Laura Pierce joined the Cold Case Unit in 2018, transferring in after 12 years in the Portland Police Bureau's Sex Crimes Division, drawn to the work, she would later say, by a belief that families deserved answers even when, especially when decades had passed, and the world had largely stopped asking the questions on their behalf. She was in her early 40s by the time Ethan's file crossed her desk, a compact, precise woman, known among colleagues for a filing system so meticulous it had become something of a department joke, and for an unusual patience with cases that offered no immediate reward, no quick resolution, only the slow accumulation of small facts assembled over months until occasionally they cohered into something resembling truth. She began, as she always began, by rereading the entire original file from the first page, a habit she credited with catching details that earlier investigators, worn down by years of dead ends, might have stopped seeing entirely. The unidentified fingerprints from Ethan's truck were still in the property room, still unmatched to anyone in the national database, and Pierce arranged for the coffee cup, remarkably, incredibly, still preserved in an evidence bag from 2000, to be resubmitted for forensic testing using techniques that had not existed when the cup was first collected. Techniques capable of extracting usable genetic material from residue that a 2000-era lab could never have processed. It took the state crime laboratory the better part of 8 months to return results, months during which Pierce worked other threads of the file in parallel, re-interviewing surviving witnesses, tracking down Warren Pratt, now in his mid-40s and still living in Portland, tracking down Owen Cross in Bend, and most significantly tracking down a name that had appeared only once in the entire original case file, in a single overlooked witness statement taken during that first frantic week of canvassing in 2000 and never followed up on again. That name belonged to a man called Frank Garrett, who had, in the year 2000, worked as a night security guard for a warehouse 2 blocks from the waterfront, and who had told a canvassing officer, in a statement that ran barely 4 sentences long, that he thought he might have seen a man matching Ethan's description walking north, away from the festival crowds, sometime around 6:30 that evening, in the company of another man he did not recognize. The statement had been logged, filed, and essentially ignored, one of dozens of similar tips that flooded in during that first week, none of which had, at the time, seemed to lead anywhere concrete enough to pursue with the limited resources available. Pierce, rereading the file 2 decades later, with the particular patience of someone who had learned that the smallest details were often the ones earlier investigators had been too busy to chase, flagged Garrett's statement and set out to find him. Frank Garrett was 71 years old by the time Detective Pierce found him, still living in Portland, though he had long since retired from security work, and now spent most of his days in a small house in the Cully neighborhood, a few miles from the waterfront, where he had once stood watch over a warehouse on summer nights. He was a heavy-set man, with thinning white hair and a slow, deliberate way of speaking, the kind of witness Pierce had learned over the years to be patient with, because rushed questioning tended to produce rushed, unreliable answers, while patience tended to produce memory, however fragmentary, however delayed by 2 decades of ordinary living, layered on top of a single half-remembered evening. Garrett remembered the night of the festival more clearly than Pierce had expected, in part because he had thought about it on and off, for 21 years, turning the memory over the way a person turns over a stone they are not sure whether to throw away, never quite convinced it mattered, never quite able to discard it either. He had been on his usual overnight shift.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
That evening, though he had come in early, around 6, to relieve the day guard before the fireworks crowds made the streets around the warehouse impossible to navigate by car. He remembered standing near the loading dock entrance, smoking a cigarette he was not supposed to smoke on duty, watching the tail end of the festival crowd drift past the mouth of the side street, and he remembered a tall young man in a plaid shirt walking briskly north, away from the water, in the company of an older man Garrett did not recognize, a stocky figure in a dark jacket despite the June warmth, his hand resting lightly but unmistakably on the younger man's shoulder in a way that Garrett, at the time, had read as merely friendly. 2 festival goers heading off together to find a better vantage point, or a bathroom or a beer. Nothing at all worth the attention of a bored security guard 3 hours into a long shift. It was only in the days after Ethan's disappearance became neighborhood news, after flyers with that same laughing photograph began appearing on telephone poles throughout the area, that Garrett had wondered with a small, uneasy jolt whether the tall young man he'd seen walking north that evening might have been the same man now missing from every corner of the neighborhood. He had given his statement to a canvassing officer within the week, offered what little detail he could recall, and had never been contacted again, had assumed, in the absence of any follow-up, that the tip had led nowhere or had never mattered in the first place. A conclusion that troubled him quietly for the next 2 decades in the way that unresolved civic duty sometimes does, a small stone he could never quite set down. Pierce asked him gently whether he could describe the older man in any more detail, and here Garrett's memory, as memories aged 21 years tend to do, grew thinner, offering only impressions rather than specifics. A heavy-set build, dark hair going grey at the temples, a way of walking that suggested someone comfortable giving direction rather than taking it. It was not much. It was, Pierce would later say, exactly the kind of fragment that an investigation built on modern forensic science no longer needed to rely upon entirely. Because by the time she sat across from Frank Garrett in his small kitchen in Cully, the State Crime Laboratory had already returned an answer to the question that had waited 21 years inside a preserved coffee cup. The genetic material recovered from the rim of that cup, the cup Ethan had left half-finished in his truck on the last afternoon anyone could account for his movements, did not match Ethan himself, a detail that confirmed what investigators had long suspected, that someone else had been in that truck at some point close to his disappearance. Run through the national genetic genealogy databases that had exploded in size and utility over the preceding half-decade, the profile returned not a direct match, but something almost as useful. A cluster of third and fourth cousin matches, distant relations who had submitted their own genetic material to consumer ancestry services, in pursuit of nothing more sinister than curiosity about their own family trees, never imagining their spit in a plastic tube might one day help identify a man connected to a 21-year-old disappearance 3 states away. It took the genealogist contracted by the Portland Police Bureau, a specialist named Diane Hodges, who had built a reputation working similar cold cases across the Pacific Northwest, the better part of 4 months to work backward through the branching cousin matches, constructing a family tree the way a person might assemble a jigsaw puzzle with most of its pieces missing, cross-referencing birth records, marriage licenses, obituaries, and public records databases that had themselves only become searchable in the Internet era, until the branches of that tree narrowed, generation by generation, toward a single name that fit both the genetic profile and the rough physical description Frank Garrett had offered from his kitchen table. A man named Marcus Bowen, 53 years old at the time Hodges identified him, who had, in the year 2000, been 32, and who had, according to old employment records Pierce subsequently obtained, worked briefly and unremarkably as a dockhand for a shipping company that operated out of the Portland waterfront, a job that would have placed him on the evening of June 2nd in the year 2000, almost exactly where Frank Garrett remembered seeing a stocky, dark-haired man walking north with his hand on a young man's shoulder. Marcus Bowen had left Portland not long after that summer, relocating first to Tacoma, and then over the following 2 decades, drifting through a series of towns along the Washington and Idaho border, working intermittently in logging and warehouse jobs, never staying anywhere more than a few years, never marrying, never appearing in any database or system that would have connected him to a disappearance in a city he had left behind, before most of his neighbors in any of his subsequent homes had ever learned his name. He had, so far as Pierce could determine, no criminal record beyond a handful of minor infractions, nothing that would have flagged him to any traditional investigative method, nothing that made him, on paper, a plausible suspect in anything at all. It was only the coffee cup and the cousins who had spit into tubes for reasons that had nothing to do with justice, and the patient work of a detective willing to reread a 21-year-old file from its very first page that had drawn a line connecting a dockhand who left Portland in 2000 to a young radio host who never came home from a festival. Pierce did not move immediately. She spent the better part of another year building a case around the genetic lead, working with prosecutors to determine what additional evidence might exist, revisiting the original crime scene photographs of Ethan's abandoned truck with fresh eyes, and eventually locating a second, more direct piece of evidence, a personal item belonging to Ethan, a distinctive silver pocket recorder, engraved on its underside with his initials by his mother as a birthday gift, years before his disappearance. That Frank Garrett, in a detail he had never thought significant enough to mention in his original brief statement, revealed he had found discarded in the alley behind the warehouse the following morning, half buried beneath a pile of festival debris, and had kept out of a vague, guilty sense that it might matter someday. In a drawer in his own home for 21 years, never quite able to explain to himself why he had not simply turned it in, and never quite able to throw it away either. That recorder, tested for genetic material along its casing, returned a profile that matched both Ethan Holloway and, faintly, a second contributor, whose genetic markers aligned with the same family cluster Diane Hodges had traced to Marcus Bowen. With the genetic link between the recorder and Marcus Bowen established, Detective Pierce obtained a warrant, and in the spring of 2021, traveled with 2 colleagues to a small town in northern Idaho where Bowen had been living for the previous 6 years, working part-time at a lumber yard and renting a single room above a hardware store not unlike the one Owen Cross had once owned back in Portland, an irony that was not lost on Pierce when she later reviewed the case notes. Bowen was 53 years old, grey-haired now, heavier than the man Frank Garrett remembered from that summer evening, living a quiet, solitary existence that neighbors in the Idaho town would later describe as unremarkable to the point of invisibility. A man who kept to himself, paid his rent on time, and rarely spoke to anyone beyond what his job required. He did not resist when detectives arrived at the lumberyard to take him into custody, and in the hours of questioning that followed, conducted with the careful, patient technique Pierce had spent her career refining, Bowen's account of that June evening in 2000 emerged in fragments, then gradually as a whole. He had been working the docks that summer, he said, and had met Ethan Holloway only once before the night of the festival, when Ethan had come down to the waterfront to record ambient sound for a KROP segment about the shipping industry, and had struck up a brief, friendly conversation with several of the dockhands, Bowen among them. Bowen described an altercation that night, not the calculated act investigators had initially feared, but something that began, in his telling, as an argument over money, a debt he claimed Ethan had unwittingly stumbled into, by mentioning during their earlier conversation information about a dock worker's side arrangement, moving goods off the manifest that Bowen and another man had been running quietly for months, a small-scale theft operation skimming inventory from shipping containers that passed through the port. Ethan, Bowen said, had not understood the significance of what he'd overheard that day, had mentioned it only in passing as an interesting detail for a radio segment, but when he encountered Bowen again that evening near the waterfront, apparently returning to record additional sound for his broadcast, Bowen panicked, certain that Ethan intended to report what he'd stumbled onto, and pulled him aside, ostensibly to talk, walking him north away from the crowds toward the warehouse district, exactly as Frank Garrett had witnessed from his post at the loading dock. What happened next, according to Bowen's account, was not the premeditated act investigators might have expected from a case that had waited 2 decades for resolution, but something far more chaotic, a confrontation that escalated in the alley behind the warehouse. Ethan attempting to explain that he had not understood the significance of anything he'd overheard and had no intention of reporting it. Bowen, frightened and increasingly desperate as the conversation spiraled beyond his control, striking Ethan during the struggle that followed, a blow that Bowen insisted he never intended to be fatal, though its consequences proved otherwise. In the panic that followed, Bowen said, he had not called for help, had not sought any assistance at all, but had instead, with the aid of one other man involved in the same theft operation, moved Ethan's body from the alley to a section of undeveloped industrial land along the river that in the year 2000 sat largely unmonitored and unused, a stretch of waterfront that would, over the following 2 decades, be redeveloped into a public park, its original ground disturbed and reshaped so thoroughly by construction that any physical trace of that night, had long since been erased by the time Pierce's investigation reached its conclusion. The second man Bowen implicated, a former dock worker named Curtis Doyle, who had also left Portland not long after that summer, had helped move Ethan's body that night and had, in the years since, said nothing to anyone. Building an ordinary life in Salem, Oregon, working as a warehouse supervisor, marrying, raising 2 children who, according to neighbors interviewed after his eventual arrest, had no idea their father carried the weight of a 2-decade-old secret. Doyle was arrested within weeks of Bowen's confession, and though he initially denied any involvement, the genetic evidence recovered from Ethan's recorder, combined with Bowen's detailed account of that night, eventually led Doyle to admit his own role, offering in his own defense only that he had been frightened, that he had believed at the time that coming forward would destroy his own life alongside Bowen's, a rationalization that offered Claire Holloway no comfort whatsoever when she heard it read aloud in the courtroom 2 years later. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the redeveloped park area, conducted by a forensic anthropology team in the months following Bowen's arrest, eventually located skeletal remains beneath a section of pathway that had been paved over during the park's construction in 2009, remains that DNA testing confirmed at last definitively were Ethan Holloway's, bringing to a close 21 years during which Claire Holloway had not known, in any certain sense, whether her brother was alive somewhere, lost to amnesia or estrangement, or gone in the way she had feared but never been permitted to confirm. The trial, held in the spring of 2023, drew intense local coverage, a case that had passed from living memory into local legend, and now returned abruptly into the present tense of a courtroom. Marcus Bowen pleaded guilty to manslaughter in exchange for his cooperation in locating Ethan's remains and in testifying against Curtis Doyle, receiving a sentence of 18 years. Doyle, convicted of evidence tampering and obstruction for his role in concealing the body, received a sentence of 7 years, a resolution that satisfied no one entirely, least of all Claire, who told reporters outside the courthouse that no number of years handed down by any judge could return the 21 years the case had already taken from her. The community's reaction to the arrests when news broke in the spring of 2021 was one of genuine disbelief, not because Bowen or Doyle were well-known figures within Portland itself, since both men had left the city decades earlier and had faded entirely from local memory, but because the resolution, when it finally came, arrived from a direction almost no one had considered, not from the hardware store owner who had once shouted at Ethan on a public sidewalk, not from the radio engineer who had spent 2 decades under a cloud of unspoken suspicion he never deserved, but from 2 men who had never appeared in a single headline, a single flyer, a single conversation among the neighbors who had spent 21 years quietly speculating about who might have taken Ethan from them. Warren Pratt, reached by a local reporter the week of Bowen's arrest, said only that he felt, for the first time since the year 2000, that he could exhale, a sentence that Claire, when she read it, understood better than anyone else alive. Owen Cross, contacted at his home in Bend, offered a brief statement expressing relief that his own name, after 2 decades, might finally be free of the shadow it had lived under since that argument on the sidewalk outside his hardware store. A shadow, he said, had followed him quietly through every subsequent friendship and business relationship he had built in the years since, even after the suspicion around him had formally lifted. Frank Garrett, the security guard whose overlooked statement and long-kept secret had ultimately unlocked the case, told Detective Pierce, in their final conversation before the trial began, that turning over Ethan's recorder after 21 years had been the only decision in his long life he genuinely regretted delaying, a confession Pierce relayed to Claire with his permission, understanding that whatever guilt an old man carried mattered less to her than the fact that her brother's own voice, recorded on cassette tapes stored inside that very device, could finally, after 2 decades of silence, be heard again. Claire Holloway, now in her mid-40s, buried her brother in the fall of 2023 beside their mother in a small cemetery on the east side of Portland, closing a chapter of her life that had occupied nearly every year of her adulthood. She kept the flyer from the kitchen cabinet, the photograph of Ethan laughing at their mother's table, framing it instead, and hanging it in her classroom, where she told her students when they asked that it was a picture of someone she had loved very much and had waited a very long time to bring home. The KROP studio on Alberta Street still broadcasts today, under new management, though long-time listeners say the station has never quite recaptured the particular warmth Ethan Holloway once gave it, the sense of a friend leaning against your porch rail on a summer evening, describing the world exactly as it appeared to him, one broadcast at a time. This video is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to actual events, is purely coincidental. This story does not depict real individuals or real criminal cases.